We navigate our daily routines under the comfortable illusion that broad daylight provides an impenetrable shield of safety. Yet the surveillance networks silently observing our cities often document a far more terrifying reality. While the actual footage of the 10 brazen abductions we are examining today rests heavily in police archives, YouTube's strict safety guidelines prevent me from broadcasting the rawest visual captures, leaving us to reconstruct these nightmares strictly through the chilling, verified facts of what those cameras witnessed. Sarah Everard was a 33-year-old marketing executive living in London, a vibrant professional whose routine movements on the evening of March 3, 2021, initially reflected the completely mundane reality of an ordinary Wednesday night out. She had spent the evening at a friend's house in the Clapham area of South London, enjoying a quiet dinner before deciding to make the roughly 2.5-mile journey back to her own apartment in Brixton by foot. The route she chose was logical and thoroughly conventional, utilizing main, well-lit thoroughfares like the A205 South Circular Road, which was heavily populated with traffic and pedestrian infrastructure, designed to ensure safety in an urban environment. Before embarking on her walk, she took standard precautions that countless women navigate daily, dressing sensibly for the mild spring weather and ensuring her cell phone was fully charged and accessible for her commute. As she navigated the streets toward Brixton, she maintained an active phone conversation with her boyfriend, Josh Loth, for roughly 15 minutes, discussing completely ordinary topics and making casual plans for the upcoming weekend. This phone call, which abruptly ended at 9:28 p.m., represented the final verified communication anyone would ever have with Sarah, marking the precise moment her life transitioned from a predictable urban commute into a sprawling, terrifying mystery. At this point in the evening, the heavy network of closed-circuit television cameras that blanket the streets of London began quietly documenting her steady progress, capturing fragmented glimpses of her walking alone through the dimly lit suburban landscape. These silent digital witnesses showed a woman acting completely normally, displaying no signs of distress, unawareness, or hesitation as she approached the intersection of Pointers Road and Cavendish Road in the quiet hours of the night. The profound tragedy of this initial phase lies in its absolute normalcy, demonstrating how a thoroughly responsible individual, following every societal rule regarding personal safety, can still be targeted in a meticulously planned, predatory strike. Her journey through the familiar streets of South London was brutally interrupted, shattering the illusion that well-lit roads and routine precautions offer any genuine protection against a determined perpetrator operating with an unassailable guise of authority. The precise inciting incident that derailed Sarah's life was not a chaotic struggle in an alleyway, but rather a chillingly calculated interception that weaponized the very systems designed to protect citizens, a moment partially captured by a passing London transport bus. Surveillance footage retrieved from a dashcam mounted on a passing bus operating on Route 137 provided investigators with a fleeting, pixelated, but undeniably vital glimpse of the abduction as it unfolded on the pavement of Pointers Road. The imagery depicted Sarah standing next to a white Vauxhall Astra with its hazard lights flashing, accompanied by a male figure, who was later identified as Wayne Cousins, a serving officer with the Metropolitan Police's elite parliamentary and diplomatic protection command. Operating entirely off-duty but armed with the physical trappings of his profession, Cousins utilized his official police warrant card and handcuffs to orchestrate a fraudulent, highly organized arrest under the pretext of enforcing the strict COVID-19 lockdown regulations that were active across the United Kingdom at the time. By leveraging the inherent authority of his badge and exploiting the contemporary public anxiety surrounding pandemic-related legal compliance, Cousins effectively neutralized any potential resistance or suspicion from his victim, ensuring total compliance in full view of passing motorists. This brazen daylight equivalent tactic, executed under the harsh glow of street lamps on a busy arterial road, demonstrates the horrifying sophistication of the kidnapping. As passing witnesses later testified, they simply assumed they were observing a routine undercover police intervention, rather than a violent abduction. The camera footage confirmed that by 9:34 p.m., Cousins had successfully confined Sarah in the rear of his rented vehicle, effectively removing her from the public sphere and initiating a dark, solitary journey away from the safety of the capital city. The profound betrayal of public trust inherent in this act transformed the nature of the crime, elevating it from a standard missing persons case into a horrifying scenario where the predator possessed the ultimate shield of institutional legitimacy. Because the abduction was executed with the smooth, practiced authority of law enforcement protocol, it generated no immediate public alarm, allowing the perpetrator to seamlessly merge back into the flow of London traffic without raising a single emergency call from passing onlookers. This methodical exploitation of power allowed Cousins to secure his victim without resorting to overt, attention-grabbing violence on the street, illustrating how the presence of a badge can serve as an impenetrable camouflage for the most catastrophic acts of malice. When Sarah failed to meet her boyfriend the following day, a rapidly escalating missing persons investigation was launched by the Metropolitan Police, who immediately began the painstaking process of retracing her final known steps through the extensive London surveillance network. Detectives executed an exhaustive digital dragnet, analyzing thousands of hours of residential doorbell cameras, commercial security footage, and traffic monitoring systems to construct a definitive timeline of her movements after she departed her friend's residence in Clapham. The critical breakthrough in the investigation materialized when analysts isolated the footage from the Route 137 bus, which not only captured the interaction between Sarah and her abductor, but also provided enough visual data to identify the specific make, model, and registration of the white Vauxhall Astra, utilizing the United Kingdom's sprawling automatic number plate recognition system. Authorities traced the vehicle's movements southward out of London and into the rural county of Kent, revealing a precise logistical map of the suspect's post-abduction route. The investigation took a dark, unprecedented turn when financial records associated with the rental car agency confirmed that the individual who had secured the Vauxhall Astra was one of their own, immediately sending shockwaves through the highest echelons of the Metropolitan Police Service. As detectives delved into Wayne Cousin's background, they uncovered a disturbing pattern of preparation, discovering that he had recently purchased a roll of self-adhesive carpet protector film and heavy-duty rubble sacks, materials that strongly indicated premeditated, lethal intent. Authorities subsequently tracked Cousin's cell phone data, which placed him in the immediate vicinity of Poinders Road at the exact time of the abduction. Before charting his subsequent journey deep into a heavily wooded area known as Hode's Wood, near Ashford in Kent. As the digital evidence mounted, outlining an undeniable sequence of events, tying a serving officer to the disappearance, specialized search teams were quietly dispatched to scour the rugged Kent countryside, transitioning the case from a search and rescue operation into a massive, covert criminal inquiry. The internal realization that the perpetrator was actively embedded within the police force required detectives to proceed with extraordinary caution and operational security, ensuring that the suspect remained completely oblivious to the rapidly closing net of digital and physical surveillance. Every piece of technological evidence, from toll booth records to supermarket security cameras showing Cousins purchasing normal household goods hours after the crime, painted a deeply unsettling portrait of a man operating with profound, detached calculation in the wake of an unspeakable atrocity. The climax of the investigation arrived on March 9, 2021, when a highly coordinated team of armed officers descended upon Wayne Cousin's suburban home in Deal, Kent, executing a high-stakes arrest that formally shattered the facade of his dual life. When confronted by his colleagues, Cousins initially attempted to deflect the mounting evidence by fabricating an elaborate, completely baseless narrative involving a violent Eastern European gang that he claimed had coerced him into handing over the missing woman to satisfy a financial debt. This desperate attempt at misdirection quickly disintegrated under the crushing weight of the accumulated forensic and digital evidence, leaving investigators to focus their full operational capacity on the remote, densely forested expanse of Hode's Wood, where the cell phone data indicated he had spent a significant amount of time. Deep within this isolated rural landscape, specialized forensic teams engaged in a grim, methodical search, combing through undergrowth and utilizing scent detection dogs to locate any anomalies in the terrain that might indicate a hidden, improvised crime scene. On March 10, the agonizing uncertainty surrounding Sarah's fate was permanently resolved when searchers uncovered human remains concealed inside a large, industrial builder's bag that had been discarded in a secluded stream within the dense woodland area. Dental records were swiftly utilized to provide formal, tragic confirmation that the remains belonged to Sarah Everett, elevating the situation into a confirmed homicide investigation that immediately commanded the attention of the global media apparatus. Further forensic analysis revealed the harrowing reality of her final hours, determining that she had been driven approximately 80 miles from the site of her abduction in London before being subjected to severe sexual assault and ultimately strangled with a standard police-issued duty belt. The discovery of the body not only provided the necessary physical evidence to upgrade the charges against Cousins to kidnapping, rape, and murder, but it also crystallized the absolute horror of a scenario where the physical instruments of law enforcement were directly utilized as the tools of execution. The unearthing of her remains in such a desolate, undignified setting stood in stark, horrifying contrast to the vibrant, urban life she had been living just days prior, underscoring the absolute finality of the violence inflicted upon her. This pivotal moment represented the catastrophic intersection of immense investigative competence in tracking the digital footprint and the devastating reality that the perpetrator had successfully utilized his institutional knowledge to temporarily obscure his lethal, premeditated actions. In the subsequent judicial proceedings, Wayne Cousins was confronted with an overwhelming deluge of incontrovertible evidence, prompting him to abandon his fabricated defense and formally plead guilty to the charges of kidnapping, rape, and murder in a packed courtroom at the Old Bailey. During the sentencing phase, Lord Justice Fulford delivered a blistering condemnation of Cousins' actions, emphasizing that the misuse of a police officer's role to perpetrate such an atrocity was so fundamentally damaging to the societal fabric that it demanded the absolute maximum penalty available under British law. Consequently, Cousins was handed a whole life order, a relatively rare and immensely severe judicial tariff in the United Kingdom that guarantees he will remain incarcerated for the entirety of his natural life without any possibility of parole, serving as a definitive, permanent removal from society. The conclusion of the legal process, however, did not quell the immense public outrage, as the case triggered a profound national reckoning regarding the systemic failures within police vetting processes and the pervasive, underlying issues of violence against women in modern society. Extensive independent inquiries were launched to dissect how a man with a history of alleged indecent exposure was permitted to retain a firearm and the authority of a warrant card, leading to sweeping reviews of professional standards and cultural dysfunctions within the Metropolitan Police Service. For the Everett family, the conclusion of the trial offered a stark, agonizing measure of legal accountability, though it could never fundamentally rectify the permanent void created by the loss of a daughter and sister whose life was extinguished in such a callous, calculated manner. The enduring legacy of this case rests not merely in the successful prosecution of a uniquely dangerous predator, but in the lasting, corrosive damage inflicted upon the foundational trust between the civilian population and the institutions sworn to protect them on the streets. It is a chilling reminder that the guise of safety can be manipulated to orchestrate the most devastating of crimes, a theme that seamlessly connects the horrors of South London to the tragic events that would soon unfold across the Atlantic Ocean. Just as Sarah Everett's routine journey home was intercepted under the false pretense of authority, we must now turn our attention to the city of Boston, where another young woman's celebratory night out culminated in a fatal encounter with a stranger's vehicle, proving once again how rapidly the security of a public space can evaporate into total darkness. Jassy Correa was a vibrant, 23, 2-year-old mother residing in the Boston area, whose immense dedication to her 2-year-old daughter served as the central, grounding force in her otherwise busy and promising young life. To commemorate her recent birthday, she made the completely understandable decision to take a rare night off from her intensive parenting responsibilities to celebrate alongside her closest friends in the bustling heart of Boston's theater district. On the exceptionally cold evening of February 23, 2019, Jassy and her social circle navigated the city's vibrant nightlife, ultimately spending the early hours of Sunday morning at the popular Venue nightclub on Tremont Street. The atmosphere inside the venue was characterized by loud music, celebratory drinks, and the standard, chaotic energy that defines weekend entertainment in a major metropolitan hub, providing no indication of the impending tragedy. Throughout the night, Jassy remained in consistent contact with her family, projecting an aura of happiness and relaxation that perfectly aligned with a well-deserved birthday celebration among trusted companions. As the nightclub began its mandatory closure procedures shortly after 2 in the morning, the patrons spilled out onto the freezing, dimly lit sidewalks of downtown Boston, creating a disjointed crowd of individuals attempting to hail rideshares and locate their parked vehicles. In this disorganized post-celebration environment, individuals are frequently separated from their friends due to the sheer volume of pedestrian traffic and the urgency to escape the biting winter temperatures of the Northeast. Jassy, having somehow become separated from her immediate group of friends amidst the chaotic dispersal of the club's attendees, found herself momentarily alone on the frigid street, attempting to secure a safe route back to her residence. This momentary isolation, while entirely common for anyone navigating the aftermath of a crowded venue closure, unknowingly transformed her from a protected member of a group into a vulnerable target within the urban landscape. The fundamental tragedy of this exposition lies in the stark contrast between a young mother's joyous celebration of life and the terrifying reality that her momentary solitude on a public street would swiftly precipitate her violent demise. The definitive turning point in Jassy's narrative did not unfold in a hidden alleyway, but rather on a heavily surveilled public street, captured with chilling clarity by the overlapping network of security cameras monitoring the Boston theater district. At approximately 20:14 a.m., external surveillance footage recorded Jassy interacting with a completely unknown male individual on Tremont Street, a man who would later be definitively identified by law enforcement as Louis D. Coleman III. Coleman, a 32-year-old resident of Providence, Rhode Island, was not known to Jassy or anyone within her social circle. Yet the visual evidence depicted him engaging her in conversation on the cold, illuminated sidewalk. While the cameras lacked audio capabilities to capture the exact nature of their exchange, investigators later surmised that Coleman utilized a deceptive pretext, likely offering the freezing young woman a safe and immediate ride home in his vehicle. Moments after this initial interaction, additional security cameras documented the critical, irrevocable action that sealed her fate, showing Jassy voluntarily entering the passenger side of Coleman's bright red Nissan Altima sedan. The footage captured the vehicle pulling away from the curb and merging into the late-night city traffic, ostensibly beginning what Jassy believed to be a secure journey back to the safety of her family and young daughter. However, the surveillance systems tracking the vehicle's trajectory quickly revealed a dark divergence from any logical route home, showing the red sedan departing the immediate Boston area and heading southward toward the Rhode Island border. This crucial piece of video evidence represents the absolute point of no return in the timeline, documenting the precise second when Jassy's personal agency was unknowingly surrendered to a violent predator, masking his intentions behind a facade of assistance. Because the abduction was facilitated through deception rather than overt physical force on the public sidewalk, passing pedestrians and security personnel remained completely oblivious to the fact that a catastrophic crime was actively occurring in their immediate vicinity. The silent, digital witness of the security cameras provided the only objective record of this fatal intersection, permanently preserving the horrifying reality of how easily a public space can facilitate a lethal entrapment under the guise of a Good Samaritan gesture. When Sunday morning arrived and Jassy failed to return home to her desperately awaiting family, a profound panic set in, prompting her relatives to immediately file a missing persons report with the Boston Police Department. Detectives rapidly mobilized, recognizing the inherent danger of the situation, and initiated a comprehensive retrieval of all available closed-circuit television footage from the businesses and traffic intersections surrounding the Venue nightclub. The investigative breakthrough occurred when analysts meticulously traced her final steps through the video data, ultimately isolating the clear, high-definition images of the red Nissan Altima and its license plate registration. This critical vehicular data allowed authorities to instantly identify Louis Coleman Athuri as the prime suspect, leading cross-jurisdictional law enforcement teams to swiftly converge upon his registered apartment complex located in Providence, Rhode Island. Upon executing a search warrant at the Providence residence, investigators discovered a deeply disturbing and highly incriminating scene that confirmed their absolute worst fears regarding Jassy's physical well-being. The apartment yielded substantial forensic evidence, indicating a violent struggle had taken place, coupled with unmistakable signs of a frantic, disorganized attempt to sanitize the crime scene using heavy chemical cleaning agents. Surveillance footage retrieved from Coleman's own apartment building provided an even more harrowing timeline, capturing him arriving in the early hours of Sunday morning carrying a limp, unresisting body slung heavily over his shoulder. Subsequent security footage from the following days depicted Coleman undertaking a series of highly suspicious, calculated actions, including purchasing large suitcases, heavy-duty trash bags, and protective Tyvek suits from local hardware stores. Realizing that the suspect had likely fled the jurisdiction with the victim's remains, authorities immediately issued a nationwide multi-state alert, distributing the vehicle's description and license plate to highway patrol units across the eastern seaboard. The investigation rapidly transformed into a high-stakes, multi-agency manhunt, heavily reliant on the digital tracking of Coleman's cell phone pings and the continuous monitoring of automated license plate readers along major interstate highways heading south. The agonizing accumulation of suspense reached its absolute peak on the afternoon of February 28, 2019, when the sprawling digital dragnet finally pinpointed the suspect's vehicle moving rapidly through the mid-Atlantic region. Troopers belonging to the Delaware State Police, operating on the urgent intelligence provided by federal authorities, successfully located the distinct red Nissan Altima traveling aggressively southbound along Interstate 95 near the city of Wilmington. Operating with extreme tactical caution, due to the severe nature of the suspected crimes, multiple law enforcement units executed a highly coordinated felony traffic stop, effectively boxing in the vehicle and neutralizing any potential road of escape. Louis Coleman Athuri was swiftly apprehended at the steering wheel without further violent incident, offering no immediate explanation or resistance as heavily armed officers secured the perimeter of the busy interstate highway. With the suspect safely in custody, investigators immediately turned their full attention to the vehicle itself, bracing for the grim reality that the extensive forensic evidence back in Rhode Island had already heavily implied. Upon opening the trunk of the Nissan Altima, law enforcement officers were confronted with a horrific and devastating discovery that immediately concluded the active search for the missing 23-year-old mother. Inside the confined space of the trunk, investigators located a large, recently purchased suitcase that directly matched the items Coleman had been recorded purchasing on the surveillance cameras outside his Providence apartment. Within this heavily secured luggage, authorities found the violently concealed remains of Jassy Correa, formally ending the desperate, 5-day interstate manhunt and transitioning the case into a definitive, multi-jurisdictional homicide investigation. The medical examiner's subsequent analysis provided a horrifyingly clear picture of the brutality inflicted upon the victim, confirming that Jassy had died as a direct result of strangulation and blunt force trauma sustained during the kidnapping. This climactic interception on a Delaware highway served as a stark, indisputable confirmation of the predator's lethal actions, transforming the circumstantial video evidence collected in Boston into a concrete, undeniable narrative of abduction and murder. because the abduction and subsequent murder inherently involved the transportation of a victim across state lines, the United States Department of Justice immediately assumed jurisdiction, charging Lewis Coleman III with the federal crime of kidnapping resulting in death. Throughout the extensive judicial proceedings that followed, federal prosecutors presented an overwhelmingly airtight case, built upon the chronological timeline established by the irrefutable network of surveillance cameras spanning from Massachusetts to Delaware. Confronted by the sheer volume of forensic evidence, digital tracking data, and his own documented movements capturing the disposal preparations, Coleman was ultimately found guilty by a federal jury after a rigorously structured trial. In June 2022, a federal judge formally sentenced Coleman to a mandatory term of life in prison without the possibility of parole, permanently removing him from society and ensuring he would never possess the opportunity to harm another individual. While this definitive judicial outcome provided the highest level of legal accountability permissible under the law, it offered only a hollow, administrative closure to a family forever shattered by the senseless execution of a beloved daughter. The most profound, enduring tragedy of this case remains the permanent reality faced by Jassie's young daughter, who has been irreversibly deprived of her mother's presence, guidance, and unconditional love due to a momentary encounter with a deceptive stranger. The chilling legacy of Jassie Correa's abduction reinforces the terrifying concept that public spaces, despite their crowds and cameras, can swiftly transform into fatal traps when malicious intent is disguised as a simple offer of assistance. It serves as a grim, documented reminder that predators frequently exploit the vulnerability of individuals simply attempting to navigate their standard routines, weaponizing societal norms of politeness and trust to facilitate their catastrophic agendas. However, the illusion of safety is not strictly limited to the chaotic environments of late-night urban centers or the vulnerability of navigating a dark city street alone. As we pivot our focus away from the bustling nightlife of the East Coast, we must now examine how this same terrifying violation of security can aggressively penetrate the heavily fortified, seemingly impenetrable walls of an affluent family home in Salt Lake City, introducing the deeply disturbing reality of Elizabeth Smart. The affluent enclave of Federal Heights in Salt Lake City, Utah, projected an aura of absolute suburban invulnerability, characterized by sprawling homes, manicured lawns, and a deeply ingrained sense of community trust. Within this highly secure environment resided the Smart family, a devoutly religious and tightly knit household that embodied the quintessential American ideal of prosperity and domestic tranquility. 14-year-old Elizabeth Smart was an integral part of this vibrant family unit, known for her dedication to her academic studies, her proficiency at playing the harp, and her gentle, highly compliant nature. On the evening of June 4, 2002, the daily rhythms of the Smart household wound down in a completely ordinary fashion, with the parents retiring to their master suite and the children settling quietly into their respective rooms. Elizabeth shared a comfortable bedroom with her 9-year-old sister, Mary Catherine, an arrangement that further reinforced the profound feeling of familial protection and absolute safety within the walls of their own home. There was absolutely no conceivable reason for the family to suspect that the heavy wooden doors and standard residential locks of their million-dollar property were completely insufficient to repel a determined, methodical predator. The structural and emotional sanctuary of the family home is universally considered the ultimate refuge from the unpredictable dangers of the outside world, a place where individuals are expected to drop their guard entirely. This inherent expectation of safety makes the events that were about to unfold within the quiet, darkened corridors of the Smart residence all the more deeply unsettling and universally terrifying to comprehend. The exposition of this tragedy forces us to immediately confront the disturbing reality that even the most affluent, well-protected domestic environments can be violently breached by someone possessing intimate, observational knowledge of the property. The serene silence of the Salt Lake City night served merely as a temporary, deceptive calm before a catastrophic intrusion permanently shattered the family's foundational sense of security and ignited a national nightmare. The inciting incident of this harrowing saga bypassed the heavily surveilled public streets entirely, materializing instead through the terrifying violation of a locked bedroom window in the dead of the night. In the early hours of June 5, Brian David Mitchell, a radical religious fanatic who had previously been briefly employed by the family as a transit handyman, methodically sliced through the screen of an open window and infiltrated the residence, navigating the dark, familiar layout of the sprawling home with chilling silence. Mitchell entered the bedroom shared by the two young sisters, fully armed with a knife and a twisted, heavily premeditated agenda. He approached Elizabeth's bed, forcefully waking the completely disoriented teenager and pressing the blade against her throat, whispering a dire ultimatum that he would slaughter her entire family if she dared to make a single sound. Immobilized by the sudden, overwhelming terror of the situation and the deeply ingrained instinct to protect her parents and siblings, Elizabeth silently complied with his whispered commands, rising from the absolute safety of her bed. Across the room, her younger sister Mary Catherine was awake, entirely paralyzed by a profound, suffocating fear, silently witnessing the dark figure escort her older sister out of the bedroom and into the night. Mitchell forced the barefoot teenager on a grueling, multi-mile forced march up the rugged, unforgiving terrain of the Wasatch Mountains, leaving the domestic sanctuary behind for a primitive, isolated campsite hidden deep within the wilderness. This precise moment represents a catastrophic point of no return, where a child was violently extracted from the most protected environment imaginable without triggering a single alarm or alerting the sleeping adults just down the hallway. The sheer audacity of penetrating a heavily occupied family home demonstrates a predatory confidence that fundamentally elevates the terror of the crime, proving that locked doors offer merely an illusion of defense against a target, fixated intruder. By morning, the devastating discovery of the empty bed and the sliced window screen would ignite one of the most exhaustive, heavily scrutinized missing persons investigations in the modern history of the United States. The ensuing 9 months represented an agonizing period of relentless, highly publicized searches, characterized by massive community mobilization, exhaustive media coverage, and deeply frustrating investigative dead ends that plagued local detectives. Law enforcement agencies initially focused their intense scrutiny on an entirely innocent local handyman, a tragic misdirection that fundamentally stalled the actual pursuit of Mitchell, while Elizabeth remained enduring daily horrors, just miles away in the mountains. The investigation experienced a monumental, desperately needed breakthrough in October when Mary Catherine, who had been quietly processing her profound trauma, suddenly recalled that the kidnapper's voice belonged to the transient worker they had known only as Emmanuel. This critical revelation allowed authorities to formally identify Brian David Mitchell and his wife, Wanda Barzee, releasing detailed composite sketches to the national public and pivoting the entire focus of the massive manhunt toward these dangerous extremists. Throughout this harrowing period, Mitchell brazenly manipulated the narrative, forcing Elizabeth to don heavy, obscuring robes and veils, effectively hiding her in plain sight and allowing the trio to navigate daylight public spaces without immediate detection. There were deeply disturbing instances where the trio actually interacted with law enforcement officers in broad daylight at public gatherings, yet the officers failed to look beneath the veils, completely missing the terrified, missing teenager standing directly in front of them. This psychological control over Elizabeth was absolute, maintained through a continuous campaign of severe physical abuse, systematic starvation, and horrific threats against her family that effectively neutralized her ability to cry out for help in heavily populated areas. The sheer brazenness of keeping a highly publicized kidnapping victim circulating through public libraries, grocery stores, and urban sidewalks highlights a terrifying intersection of predatory manipulation and systemic societal blindness. As the months dragged into the spring of 2003, the nationwide distribution of Mitchell's composite sketch finally began to saturate the public consciousness, arming everyday citizens with the vital visual data necessary to penetrate his deceptive religious camouflage. The tension continuously mounted as the trio moved back to the Salt Lake City area from a brief stint in California, unknowingly walking directly into a highly sensitized urban environment where the population was actively hunting for their faces. The climax of this monumental investigation did not occur during a tactical midnight raid, but rather unfolded in the bright, revealing light of a mundane weekday afternoon on a highly active suburban thoroughfare. On March 12, 2003, multiple highly observant civilians driving along State Street in the heavily populated city of Sandy, Utah, simultaneously noticed three transient individuals walking down the sidewalk in distinctive, heavily layered clothing. Recognizing the piercing, unmistakable facial features of Brian David Mitchell from the relentless television broadcasts and distributed wanted posters, these vigilant citizens immediately contacted the local authorities, triggering a rapid and overwhelming police response to the area. Officers from the Sandy Police Department swiftly intercepted the trio on the bustling daytime street, completely surrounding them, separating the heavily veiled young woman from her captors, and initiating a tense, deeply sensitive interrogation on the pavement. Heavily indoctrinated by 9 months of continuous psychological torture, Elizabeth initially denied her true identity to the police, claiming her name was Augustine, and reciting the fabricated religious narratives Mitchell had violently drilled into her memory. Recognizing the profound, paralyzing fear dictating the young woman's responses, the responding officers displayed exceptional patience and investigative intuition, gently pressing her for the truth while physically shielding her from Mitchell's intimidating line of sight. After several agonizing minutes of gentle but persistent questioning on the public street, the psychological dam finally broke, and the teenager quietly but definitively confirmed to the surrounding officers that she was, in fact, Elizabeth Smart. This sudden, miraculous admission immediately prompted the formal, aggressive arrest of Mitchell and Brazen on the sidewalk, physically neutralizing the threat and instantly ending one of the most horrific, high-profile captivity sagas in modern American history. The dramatic rescue, executed in full view of passing suburban traffic and daytime shoppers, served as a stunning conclusion to a case that had dominated national headlines, proving unequivocally that an informed, vigilant public remains law enforcement's most potent asset. The immediate aftermath of the State Street interception resulted in an emotional, highly publicized reunification between Elizabeth and her profoundly relieved family, offering a deeply rare and universally celebrated outcome within the typically grim true crime genre. However, the subsequent legal proceedings against her captors evolved into a protracted, deeply frustrating judicial saga that dragged on for years due to relentless, calculated debates regarding Brian David Mitchell's mental competency to stand trial. Wanda Brazen ultimately accepted a plea agreement, formally admitting her role in the horrific abduction and receiving a lengthy federal prison sentence, while Mitchell's defense team continuously utilized his bizarre, religiously fanatic courtroom behavior to purposefully stall the justice system. In 2010, Mitchell was finally deemed legally competent to face a federal jury, where he was definitively convicted of aggravated kidnapping and transporting a minor across state lines for sexual purposes, culminating in 2 mandatory life sentences. The conclusion of this extensive legal battle permanently removed an exceptionally dangerous predator from society and provided the strict judicial finality necessary for Elizabeth to fully reclaim her narrative and forge a remarkably powerful path forward. Refusing to be forever defined by her victimization, Elizabeth Smart transitioned into a highly influential, nationally recognized advocate for child safety and victims' rights, utilizing her deeply personal trauma to enact meaningful legislative change and directly support other survivors. While the resolution of her case stands as a powerful testament to profound human resilience and the critical importance of public vigilance, it also rigorously cements the terrifying reality that absolute safety within our own homes is often a fragile illusion. The undisputed fact that a predator could successfully bypass residential security and then seamlessly hide his victim within the bustling daytime crowds forces us to completely reevaluate our foundational understanding of how and where abductions actually occur. This sobering realization effortlessly bridges our investigative journey back to the East Coast, where we must confront a tragedy that did not begin in a dark bedroom, but rather on a sunny Florida afternoon, captured entirely by an unblinking mechanical eye. We must now turn our full, unwavering attention to the heartbreaking, deeply disturbing case of Carly Brucia, where the concept of a stranger operating in plain sight transforms into a permanent, chilling digital record that shocked the world. The city of Sarasota, Florida, is widely recognized for its vibrant coastal community, offering residents a picturesque, sun-drenched environment that fundamentally projects an aura of relaxed, suburban security. On the afternoon of February 1, 2004, a day celebrated across the United States as Super Bowl Sunday, this typical Floridian tranquility served as the completely unassuming backdrop for an 11-year-old girl simply attempting to navigate a deeply familiar route. Carly Brucia, an ordinary, lively middle school student, had spent the sunny afternoon visiting a friend's house, engaging in standard childhood activities, before deciding to begin the relatively short walk back to her own family residence. The journey she embarked upon was heavily pedestrianized and thoroughly integrated into the daily rhythms of the neighborhood, consisting of well-traveled sidewalks and busy commercial corridors that offered absolutely no indication of imminent danger. In a society that inherently associates the bright, revealing light of the afternoon sun with safety and visibility, a child walking home in broad daylight is universally perceived as a low-risk, completely routine activity. As she navigated the paved pathways of her community, passing local businesses and residential streets, there was a profound innocence to her movements, representing the absolute normalcy of youth unburdened by the terrifying realities of predatory violence. Her family, anticipating her imminent arrival, had no logical reason to suspect that the brief, heavily populated span of pavement separating their home from her friend's house would transform into a catastrophic trap. The profound tragedy of this initial phase lies entirely in its mundane nature, illustrating how the comfortable routines of suburban childhood can be violently intersected by unimaginable malice, without any prior warning or atmospheric shift. This stark contrast between the bright, cheerful Florida afternoon and the horrifying darkness that was actively waiting for her along the road serves to permanently shatter the deeply ingrained societal assumption that daylight itself provides a protective barrier against abduction. The precise, irrevocable moment that permanently derailed Carly's life did not occur in a secluded forest or an abandoned alleyway, but rather directly behind a bustling local business, silently documented by an unblinking mechanical witness. As Carly walked past the rear perimeter of Evie's car wash on the heavily trafficked Bee Ridge Road, a strategically placed security camera captured an interaction that would soon become one of the most infamous, chilling pieces of footage in modern criminal history. At approximately 6:21 p.m., the grainy black and white surveillance video recorded an adult male, distinctly dressed in a standard mechanic's uniform, purposefully approaching the solitary 11-year-old girl as she attempted to cross the paved lot. The camera documented a brief, seemingly calm exchange of words, entirely devoid of the chaotic, highly visible struggle that the public typically associates with a violent street-level abduction. However, the terrifying reality of the situation rapidly materialized when the unidentified man suddenly reached out and firmly grasped Carly by her wrist, physically asserting absolute control over the significantly smaller child. Without any further hesitation, the man assertively led the unresisting, visibly intimidated girl away from the camera's field of view, directing her toward an unseen vehicle parked just outside the frame. This silent, terrifying digital capture represents the absolute point of no return, preserving the exact second when an innocent child was entirely stripped of her agency and forced into a lethal scenario by a stranger operating with brazen confidence. Because the perpetrator utilized coercion and physical intimidation rather than a chaotic, loud assault, passing motorists and nearby patrons remained completely oblivious to the catastrophic crime actively unfolding in their immediate peripheral vision. This incredibly stark, Undeniable video evidence fundamentally altered the trajectory of the ensuing investigation, providing a horrific, indisputable visual record of a daylight abduction that would permanently haunt the collective consciousness of the entire nation. When Carly failed to arrive home within the expected time frame, her parents immediately recognized the severe anomaly in her behavior, prompting a frantic, rapidly escalating missing persons report to the local law enforcement authorities. Realizing the immense gravity of the situation, investigators swiftly mobilized and executed a comprehensive sweep of the commercial corridor, ultimately discovering the critical surveillance tape at the car wash that visually confirmed the family's absolute worst fears. Understanding the sheer power of visual evidence, authorities immediately released the chilling abduction footage to the national media apparatus, simultaneously triggering an Amber Alert and initiating an unprecedented, nationwide manhunt that dominated news cycles for consecutive days. The video was continuously broadcast across major television networks, prompting specialized agencies, including the FBI and researchers from NASA, to actively collaborate in enhancing the grainy footage to extract a clearer image of the perpetrator's face and distinct physical characteristics. As the enhanced video saturated the public sphere, the massive community awareness campaign yielded a crucial, definitive breakthrough when multiple individuals, including the suspect's own brother, contacted police to identify the man in the mechanic's uniform. The collective intelligence explicitly pointed to Joseph P. Smith, a 37-year-old local automotive mechanic with a heavily documented, extensive criminal history involving severe drug addiction, violence, and a previous arrest for false imprisonment. Armed with this definitive identification, law enforcement officers swiftly apprehended Smith on an entirely unrelated parole violation, securely removing him from the streets while they desperately interrogated him regarding the current whereabouts of the missing 11-year-old girl. Despite being confronted with the overwhelming, irrefutable visual evidence of his own actions captured on tape, Smith remained chillingly stoic, initiating a tense, agonizing standoff with detectives, who were acutely aware that every passing hour drastically reduced the probability of finding Carly alive. The investigation morphed into a desperate psychological battle within the interrogation room, heavily juxtaposed against the massive, exhaustive physical search of the surrounding Sarasota swamps and woodlands being conducted by thousands of desperate volunteers and specialized canine units. The unbearable tension that had gripped the entire nation finally ruptured on February 5, following days of intense, relentless pressure from both law enforcement interrogators and the suspect's deeply conflicted family members. Operating from within his jail cell, Joseph P. Smith ultimately abandoned his steadfast denials, initiating a heavily monitored phone call to his brother where he cryptically, but definitively confessed to the catastrophic outcome of the abduction. He deliberately directed his brother, and consequently the massive armada of waiting law enforcement officers, to a specific, heavily overgrown field located directly behind the Central Church of Christ on Proctor Road, a mere few miles from the site of the car wash. As specialized forensic teams and heavily armed officers descended upon the designated, deeply secluded location, the desperate, lingering hopes for a miraculous rescue were permanently, violently extinguished in the dense Florida brush. Deep within the overgrown terrain, investigators located the partially clothed remains of Carly Brucia, providing devastating, undeniable physical confirmation that the terrifying sequence captured on the surveillance tape had rapidly culminated in a brutal execution. The subsequent medical examiner's analysis revealed a horrifying narrative of her final moments, confirming that the young girl had been subjected to severe sexual assault before being deliberately and violently strangled to death shortly after her initial abduction. This monumental, heartbreaking discovery instantly transformed the highly publicized missing persons investigation into a definitive capital murder case, violently ripping away any remaining ambiguity surrounding the true, lethal intentions of the man in the mechanic's uniform. The discovery of the body at the churchyard served as the ultimate, tragic climax, permanently linking the silent, grainy digital image of a child being led away by her wrist to the brutal, unforgiving reality of a physical crime scene. The undeniable finality of finding her remains forced the community to confront the absolute horror that a determined predator had successfully utilized the illusion of daytime safety to orchestrate and execute a monstrous atrocity against a completely defenseless target. In the immediate aftermath of the horrific discovery, the local prosecutor's office aggressively pursued a capital murder indictment against Joseph P. Smith, constructing an overwhelmingly airtight judicial case built heavily upon the irrefutable video evidence and his subsequent, corroborated confession. During the highly publicized 2005 trial, the jury was forced to repeatedly view the deeply disturbing car wash footage, ultimately requiring only a few hours of deliberation to return a definitive guilty verdict on all charges, including first-degree murder, kidnapping, and capital sexual battery. The judicial process subsequently transitioned into the penalty phase, where the jury returned a 10-2 recommendation for the ultimate punishment, prompting the presiding judge to formally sentence Smith to death by lethal injection for his monstrous actions. However, the pursuit of strict judicial finality was severely hindered by a deeply protracted, agonizing series of legal appeals and constitutional debates regarding the non-unanimous nature of his death sentence, forcing the Bruscia family to endure decades of continuous, painful uncertainty. Despite the relentless legal maneuvering that repeatedly delayed his scheduled execution, the definitive conclusion to Smith's narrative ultimately materialized outside the confines of the formal judicial execution chamber. In July 2021, at the age of 55, Joseph P. Smith died of severe liver cancer, while firmly secured within the walls of a Florida state prison, entirely removing him from the earthly plane and closing one of the most heavily documented predatory chapters in modern history. While his death effectively ended the agonizing legal saga for Carly's grieving family, it provided only a cold, administrative closure to a tragedy that had permanently shattered the foundational sense of security for parents across the nation. The enduring legacy of Carly Bruscia's abduction remains deeply embedded in the terrifying realization that public surveillance, while a highly potent investigative tool, is frequently incapable of serving as a preventative shield against a brazen, daylight assault. This sobering concept of an unblinking camera passively recording a terrifying abduction seamlessly bridges our narrative from the sun-drenched streets of Florida to the freezing, isolated expanse of Anchorage, Alaska. We must now turn our full attention to a secluded roadside coffee shack, where another silent camera captured the chilling, methodical strike of a highly organized serial killer, dragging a young woman named Samantha Koenig into a completely unprecedented nightmare. Anchorage, Alaska, presents a unique urban landscape where the harsh, isolating realities of the northern environment frequently intersect with standard, bustling commercial routines. A defining characteristic of this heavily motorized city is the ubiquitous presence of drive-thru coffee shacks, small, standalone structures situated along busy commuter arteries that offer rapid service to drivers braving the extreme winter conditions. 18-year-old Samantha Koenig was employed at one such establishment, a highly visible kiosk named Common Grounds Espresso located directly on the heavily trafficked Tudor Road. On the evening of February 1, 2012, Samantha was concluding her shift, operating entirely alone within the brightly lit confines of the small wooden structure as the surrounding city traffic flowed steadily past her windows. In the context of Alaskan commercial culture, working a solo shift at a roadside kiosk is considered a thoroughly standard, low-risk occupation. Heavily reliant on the continuous stream of customers and the bright exterior floodlights to provide a pervasive sense of security. As she went about her closing duties, wiping down espresso machines and counting the daily register, she remained in casual digital contact with her boyfriend, projecting the absolute normalcy of a teenager simply waiting to clock out and head home. The shack itself, while physically small, was structurally integrated into a busy commercial plaza, entirely devoid of the secluded, hidden characteristics typically associated with the staging ground for a violent crime. There was absolutely no logical reason for anyone to suspect that this brightly illuminated focal point of daily commerce would be violently breached by an apex predator who had been meticulously studying its vulnerabilities. The profound tragedy of this initial phase lies in the stark realization that her perceived safety was entirely dependent on an unwritten societal contract, that aggressive violence does not typically occur under the glaring lights of a major municipal thoroughfare. This comforting illusion of public security was about to be methodically dismantled by an individual who actively sought out the false confidence provided by routine and exposure, turning her highly visible workplace into a catastrophic trap. The precise mechanism of Samantha's disappearance was not left to forensic speculation, but was instead recorded with chilling, indisputable clarity by the coffee shack's internal closed-circuit television system. As the evening progressed and the flow of customers temporarily ceased, the surveillance camera captured a heavily bundled male figure approaching the service window, entirely on foot, a slight deviation from the standard vehicular traffic. The visual record documented the man, later identified as the highly organized serial killer Israel Keys, ordering a beverage before suddenly producing a concealed firearm and violently asserting absolute control over the isolated teenager. Displaying a terrifying level of practiced, methodical calmness, Keys forced his way through the small service window and into the confined space of the kiosk, instantly neutralizing any potential avenue of escape for the terrified barista. The unblinking digital eye of the camera recorded him systematically securing Samantha's hands with heavy-duty zip ties, executing the restraint with a chilling efficiency that strongly indicated extensive, premeditated rehearsal for this exact scenario. Without any frantic movements or visible panic, Keys then ordered the bound teenager out of the brightly lit structure, forcing her to walk into the freezing Alaskan night toward his vehicle parked just out of the camera's visual range. This silent, terrifying digital capture represents the absolute point of no return, preserving the exact minute an innocent young woman was forcefully extracted from a public commercial space by a predator operating with devastating, military-like precision. Because the abduction was executed rapidly and contained entirely within the structural footprint of the kiosk, passing motorists on Tudor Road remained completely oblivious to the catastrophic felony actively unfolding merely yards away from their headlights. The irrefutable video evidence immediately escalated the situation from a routine missing persons inquiry into a verified, high-stakes kidnapping investigation, providing authorities with a horrifying visual confirmation of the calculated violence that had descended upon their city. When the shack's owner discovered the empty kiosk and the deeply alarming security footage the following morning, the Anchorage Police Department and the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately launched a massive, heavily coordinated interagency manhunt. The investigation was almost immediately subjected to a profound psychological torment when Keys, utilizing the victim's stolen cellular phone, began sending cryptic, taunting text messages to her family and boyfriend, deliberately manipulating their desperate hopes. The cruelty of the situation escalated exponentially when authorities discovered a ransom demand seeking $30,000, accompanied by a deeply disturbing Polaroid photograph of Samantha bound and holding a recent newspaper, a classic proof of life tactic that masked a much darker reality. For weeks, a suffocating silence fell over the investigation, agonizingly drawn out until a sudden, pivotal technological breakthrough occurred when financial monitors detected activity on a debit card that Keys had violently stolen from Samantha during the abduction. Investigators initiated a complex, high-stakes digital tracking operation, mapping a bewildering trail of automated teller machine withdrawals that inexplicably jumped from Alaska to the American Southwest, outlining the chaotic, cross-country movements of the suspect. The FBI rapidly deployed localized surveillance units to various ATM locations across Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, frantically analyzing localized security footage to capture a clear image of the individual actively draining the illicitly acquired funds. The strategic placement of these financial breadcrumbs revealed a suspect operating a rented white Ford Focus, providing law enforcement with the critical vehicular data necessary to issue a localized, highly urgent bulletin to highway patrol agencies across the southern United States. This excruciating phase of the investigation highlighted a massive, heavily resourced technological pursuit contrasting the silent, agonizing weight of the victim's family with the frantic, data-driven mapping of a predator, actively utilizing modern banking infrastructure to fund his continued evasion. The immense, sprawling digital dragnet finally collapsed directly upon the suspect on the afternoon of March 13, 2012, when a highly observant Texas Highway Patrol trooper identified the targeted white Ford Focus speeding along a rural stretch of State Highway 103 near Lufkin. Executing a high-risk felony traffic stop, law enforcement officers swiftly surrounded the vehicle, successfully apprehending Israel Kais without a violent shootout, securely taking him into federal custody and initiating the profound unraveling of his dark, complex existence. Upon his extradition back to Alaska, the full, catastrophic scope of his criminality materialized during a series of chilling, deeply disturbing interrogation sessions where Kais willingly, almost clinically, detailed his methodology. Keyes provided a staggering, unprecedented confession, revealing that he was not merely a localized kidnapper, but a highly sophisticated, cross-country serial killer who meticulously buried hidden kill caches containing weapons and body disposal supplies across the United States years in advance of his strikes. The most devastating revelation, however, pertained directly to Samantha Koenig. Keyes callously admitted that he had sexually assaulted and murdered the young woman within hours of her abduction from the coffee shack, entirely destroying the desperate hopes maintained by her family. He chillingly detailed how he had temporarily frozen her remains in his shed, briefly departing for a pre-planned family cruise before returning to thaw her body and meticulously apply theatrical makeup to stage the horrific, fabricated ransom photograph that had so profoundly tormented investigators. He then provided specific geographical coordinates, leading diving teams directly to frozen Matanuska Lake north of Anchorage, where authorities executed the grim, methodical recovery of Samantha's dismembered remains from beneath the thick layer of winter ice. This climactic, horrifying admission fundamentally shifted the paradigm of modern criminal profiling, exposing the existence of a predator who deliberately lacked a specific victim profile, hunting purely on opportunity and relying heavily on intense logistical preparation to permanently evade standard investigative techniques. The formalized legal proceedings against Israel Keyes were abruptly and violently terminated before they could ever truly commence in a court of law, completely subverting the judicial system's capacity to deliver structured, public accountability for his monstrous actions. In December 2012, while firmly secured within the heavily monitored confines of the Anchorage Correctional Complex, Keyes committed suicide inside his cell by utilizing a concealed razor blade and a tightly fashioned ligature, permanently silencing the only source of information regarding his other unknown victims. His death immediately forced the Federal Bureau of Investigation to unilaterally close the active prosecution, leaving a sprawling, highly complex legacy of unsolved missing persons cases across the nation that remain tenuously linked to his extensive travel records. For the Koenig family, the confirmation of Samantha's death and the subsequent suicide of her murderer provided a brutally cold, deeply unsatisfactory closure, entirely devoid of the public reckoning and legal justice that typically accompany the resolution of a major homicide investigation. The chilling, undeniable reality of the common grounds espresso abduction permanently dismantled the foundational concept of safety in well-lit, publicly accessible commercial spaces, proving that extreme, methodical evil can easily penetrate the most ordinary of daily routines. The camera footage capturing her forced extraction remains a profound, historical testament to the devastating speed and efficiency of a highly organized predator operating entirely without geographical or psychological boundaries. However, while Samantha's terrifying ordeal concluded rapidly under the dark Alaskan sky, the horrifying concept of a daylight abduction can also trigger an agonizing, decades-long nightmare of captivity entirely hidden from public view. As we pivot our investigative focus away from the frozen north, we must now examine a serene suburban morning in California, where an 11-year-old girl waiting for a school bus was swallowed whole by a passing vehicle, introducing the profoundly disturbing, enduring survival saga of J.C. Dugard. The quiet, heavily forested community of South Lake Tahoe, California, was defined by its stunning natural beauty and a pervasive atmosphere of deeply relaxed mountain town security. On the morning of June 10, 1991, this idyllic environment served as the completely ordinary backdrop for the start of a typical school day for 11-year-old J.C. Dugard, a bright, deeply loved child navigating the standard routines of the 5th grade. At approximately 8:00 a.m., J.C. departed her family home and began the short, entirely familiar walk down Washone Boulevard to her designated school bus stop, a daily migration undertaken by countless children across the country without a second thought. The environment was characterized by bright morning sunlight, clear skies, and the presence of residential homes lining the street, creating a robust, communal sense of visibility and deeply ingrained suburban safety. Her stepfather, Carl Probin, was actively observing her progress from the driveway of their residence, providing a direct, protective line of sight as the young girl confidently walked down the paved street toward the corner. In the context of standard parental risk assessment, an 11-year-old walking merely yards away under the direct, watchful eye of a guardian in a quiet residential neighborhood is universally considered an activity entirely devoid of imminent threat. There was absolutely no logical reason to suspect that this heavily monitored, exceedingly brief journey would be violently intersected by a predator actively hunting along the quiet suburban thoroughfares of Lake Tahoe. The profound tragedy of this initial phase lies entirely in its absolute normalcy, illustrating how the deeply comfortable routines of childhood can be violently shattered in an instant, even while functioning under the protective gaze of a parent. This stark reality forces a deeply unsettling reevaluation of our foundational understanding of safety, proving that constant vigilance is sometimes completely insufficient to repel a sudden, highly aggressive vehicular assault. The specific, devastating inciting incident that violently erased J.C. from her life was not a silent, unseen disappearance, but rather a brazen, high-speed abduction executed in full view of her horrified stepfather. As J.C. approached the corner, a two-tone gray Ford sedan abruptly swerved off the road and aggressively intercepted her, rapidly braking to a halt directly alongside the solitary 11-year-old girl. Before anyone could process the anomaly of the situation, the vehicle's doors burst open, and an adult female, later identified as Nancy Garrido, lunged from the car, violently grabbing J.C. and physically dragging her into the back seat. Simultaneously, the driver, Philip Garrido, a heavily convicted, actively paroled sex offender, accelerated the vehicle, executing a violent U-turn and peeling away from the curb with the terrified child trapped inside. Carl Probin, witnessing the catastrophic event unfold merely yards away, instantly realized the absolute horror of the situation and frantically sprinted down the street, mounting a desperate pursuit on his bicycle. But he was rapidly outpaced by the accelerating sedan. This terrifying, incredibly brief sequence of events represents the absolute point of no return, documenting the exact, highly traumatic moment when a child was aggressively extracted from her environment through overwhelming, coordinated physical force. Because the abduction was executed with the speed and violence of a specialized military extraction, it completely neutralized any potential defensive response from the victim or her guardian, leaving behind only the echoing sound of screeching tires and a deeply profound, agonizing. This brutal vehicular strike immediately initiated one of the most exhaustive, emotionally devastating missing persons investigations in the history of California, fundamentally altering the trajectory of multiple lives and exposing critical flaws within the state's penal oversight systems. The subsequent 18 years represented an agonizing, seemingly endless period of profound darkness for J.C.'s family, characterized by relentless false leads, a continuously expanding national media presence, and the agonizing, daily reality of an empty bedroom. Law enforcement agencies executed massive, highly coordinated search grids across the rugged Sierra Nevada terrain, repeatedly analyzing the localized traffic patterns and meticulously interviewing hundreds of registered sex offenders residing within the Northern California jurisdiction. However, the investigation repeatedly stalled against an impenetrable wall of silence, primarily because Philip Garrido had successfully transported J.C. to a heavily fortified, hidden compound located within the backyard of his own residence in Antioch, California. This specific, localized failure of intelligence occurred despite Garrido being heavily monitored by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. His parole officers visited his residence numerous times over the years, but systematically failed to discover the complex network of hidden tents, high fences, and soundproofed sheds where JC was actively imprisoned. During this deeply horrific 18-year span of total isolation, JC endured continuous physical, emotional, and psychological abuse, ultimately being forced to bear 2 daughters, fathered by her captor within the squalid, deeply unsanitary conditions of the backyard prison. Garrido maintained absolute psychological control through a deeply manipulative, pseudo-religious doctrine, systematically eroding her identity and enforcing a profound sense of helplessness that prevented her from attempting escape, even when he occasionally forced her to interact with his commercial clients. The sheer, unfathomable length of her captivity highlights a catastrophic, systemic failure of the parole oversight apparatus, which fundamentally failed to detect a massive, ongoing felony occurring directly beneath its administrative nose. As the years dissolved into decades, the active missing persons case gradually cooled, existing primarily as a tragic, unsolved local legend, while JC silently endured a nightmarish reality heavily concealed behind a standard, unassuming suburban fence. The miraculous, entirely unexpected climax of this enduring nightmare did not originate from a dedicated investigative task force, but rather through the highly intuitive, deeply observant actions of a specialized campus police officer operating over 100 miles away. On August 24, 2009, Philip Garrido, accompanied by the 2 young girls he had fathered with JC, arrived at the heavily populated campus of the University of California, Berkeley, attempting to distribute obscure, deeply rambling religious pamphlets. The incredibly erratic, concerning behavior displayed by Garrido, coupled with the deeply unusual, profoundly pale appearance of the 2 young girls who seemed heavily subservient and completely unaccustomed to standard social interaction, immediately drew the attention of UC Berkeley police officer Allie Jacobs. Acting entirely on her own professional instincts, Officer Jacobs initiated a deeply inquisitive background check, discovering Garrido's extensive status as a registered sex offender and formally alerting his assigned parole agent regarding the highly suspicious interaction on the university campus. This critical transmission of intelligence prompted the parole agent to strictly mandate an immediate, mandatory meeting with Garrido at the local parole office the following day, explicitly ordering him to bring all the individuals who were currently residing at his Antioch property. The next morning, when Garrido arrived at the Concord parole office accompanied by his wife Nancy, the 2 young girls, and a deeply reserved, heavily subdued woman who claimed her name was Alyssa, the meticulously constructed facade of his hidden life finally began to fracture. During a highly sensitive, deeply probing interrogation conducted by seasoned investigators who recognized profound inconsistencies in Alyssa's fabricated narrative, the psychological conditioning abruptly shattered, and the 31-year-old woman quietly, but firmly, revealed her true identity. This staggering, deeply emotional admission instantly concluded an agonizing 18-year mystery, prompting the immediate, aggressive arrest of both Philip and Nancy Garrido within the parole office and formally triggering the profound, highly complex process of JC's reintegration into society. The ensuing legal proceedings against the Garridos were remarkably brief, completely lacking the protracted, agonizing trials that typically define high-profile kidnapping cases, primarily due to the overwhelmingly airtight, indisputable nature of the evidence discovered at the Antioch compound. Faced with the reality of his deeply fortified backyard prison, and the irrefutable DNA evidence proving his paternity of the 2 children, Philip Garrido formally pleaded guilty to a massive litany of charges, including kidnapping and multiple counts of sexual assault. In 2011, he was definitively sentenced to an unprecedented 431 years to life in prison, while his wife Nancy received a 36-year sentence, permanently securing their removal from society and delivering the absolute maximum judicial penalty available under California law. The resolution of this case triggered massive, deeply necessary systemic reforms within the California Department of Corrections, leading to a massive overhaul of parole officer training protocols and stricter enforcement of property inspections for registered sex offenders. J.C. Dugard, defying the devastating odds of her horrific captivity, transitioned into a highly visible, deeply inspiring author and advocate, establishing the JYC Foundation to directly support families recovering from severe trauma and abduction. Her profound, enduring resilience serves as a powerful testament to the human capacity to survive and reclaim agency following the most catastrophic violations of personal liberty imaginable. However, while JC's narrative miraculously concluded with a deeply celebrated rescue and reunification, the terrifying reality of a daytime abduction frequently culminates in a much darker, far more permanent tragedy. As we transition our focus from the dense suburbs of California to the sprawling, snow-covered plains of North Dakota, we must examine a highly surveilled retail environment where another young woman's routine departure from work was violently intercepted, plunging the community of Grand Forks into the heartbreaking mystery of Drew Jordan. Grand Forks, North Dakota, is characterized by its resilient, tightly knit community and a bustling university culture that thoroughly permeates the local commercial landscape. On the chilly afternoon of November 22, 2003, the Columbia Mall served as the vibrant epicenter of weekend activity, providing a seemingly impenetrable atmosphere of public security for shoppers and retail employees alike. 22-year-old Drew Jordan, a highly motivated graphic arts student at the University of North Dakota and a prominent member of a local sorority, was navigating the completely ordinary conclusion of her shift at the mall's Victoria's Secret location. Her life was defined by a profound dedication to her academic pursuits, her extensive social network, and the standard, routine responsibilities of a young adult working a retail job to support her education. As the afternoon transitioned into the early, heavily shadowed evening typical of the northern winter, Drew engaged in standard consumer behavior, purchasing a purse from a neighboring store before preparing to initiate her short commute home. The sprawling, heavily utilized parking lot encompassing the mall was thoroughly illuminated and consistently populated with pedestrian and vehicular traffic, projecting the absolute illusion of a highly secure, monitored environment. In contemporary society, the transition from a brightly lit commercial building to a parked vehicle is universally perceived as a mundane, inherently safe necessity, completely devoid of any elevated predatory risk. There was absolutely no logical reason for Drew, or anyone within her immediate vicinity, to suspect that the cold, expansive asphalt surrounding the mall had been actively compromised by a highly dangerous individual actively hunting for a vulnerable target. The profound tragedy of this initial phase lies in the absolute normalcy of a college student simply trying to go home after a long shift, highlighting how predators specifically exploit the routine, transitional moments of our daily lives. This stark contrast between the bright, bustling interior of the commercial center and the devastating, unseen danger lurking merely yards away in the parking lot permanently shatters the deeply ingrained assumption that public spaces offer an inherent shield against targeted violence. The precise, terrifying moment that permanently derailed Drew's promising life was partially documented by the mall's extensive closed-circuit television network, which passively recorded her final, unassuming movements through the public concourse. At approximately 5:00 p.m., security cameras captured the young woman calmly exiting the glass doors of the retail center, visually confirming her transition from the highly monitored interior out into the sprawling, freezing expanse of the exterior parking lot. As she navigated the rows of parked cars toward her own vehicle, Drew maintained an active, completely routine cellular phone conversation with her boyfriend, Chris Lang, discussing their casual plans for the upcoming evening. This digital tether provided a real-time, auditory connection to her movements, heavily reinforcing the illusion of safety as she walked alone through the cold North Dakota air toward her designated parking spot. However, the comforting normalcy of this phone call was violently, irrevocably shattered when Lang suddenly heard a brief, sharp exclamation followed by the immediate, deadening silence of a dropped connection. This chilling auditory termination marked the exact, catastrophic moment of physical interception, where a deeply convicted, highly violent predator named Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. aggressively ambushed the solitary student before she could secure herself within the safety of her vehicle. Although the physical struggle itself occurred in a terrifying blind spot just beyond the definitive reach of the surveillance lenses, the camera's timestamp permanently preserved the horrifyingly brief window of time in which the abduction was successfully executed. The perpetrator utilized overwhelming physical force and the element of total surprise to neutralize her resistance, rapidly forcing the terrified young woman into his own vehicle without triggering a massive public alarm or drawing the attention of passing shoppers. This devastating incident fundamentally underscores the terrifying reality that even the most heavily trafficked, publicly visible commercial parking lots contain fleeting pockets of vulnerability that a patient, highly motivated predator can exploit with catastrophic efficiency. The silent, digital witness of the mall cameras provided the only objective visual record of her departure, permanently freezing the image of a completely unaware student walking directly into a lethal, meticulously calculated trap. When Drew failed to arrive at her scheduled evening destination and her boyfriend's frantic return calls went unanswered, a profound, rapidly escalating panic swept through her community, prompting an immediate, massive mobilization of local law enforcement. The disappearance triggered one of the largest, most exhaustive missing persons searches in the history of North Dakota, drawing thousands of desperate university students, local residents, and specialized state agencies into a highly coordinated, desperate grid search. Investigators immediately leveraged critical cellular technology, analyzing the complex network of telecommunication towers, to successfully trace the final, faint digital pings emitted by Drew's phone, mapping a highly disturbing trajectory that moved eastward across the state border into Minnesota. This vital digital intelligence was rapidly cross-referenced with local law enforcement databases, swiftly directing intense investigative scrutiny toward Alfonso Rodriguez Jr., a Level 3 registered sex offender who had just been released after serving a 23-year sentence for violent assaults. Recognizing the immense, immediate danger posed by a predator of this caliber, authorities aggressively moved to interrogate Rodriguez, securing extensive search warrants for his residence and the specific vehicle he was known to operate. A meticulous, highly complex forensic analysis of his car yielded deeply disturbing, incontrovertible evidence, revealing substantial pooling of blood in the trunk alongside a massive, frantic application of heavy chemical cleaning agents designed to obscure a violent crime scene. Despite the overwhelming, scientifically verified presence of the victim's DNA within the suspect's vehicle, Rodriguez maintained a chilling, absolute silence regarding her precise whereabouts, initiating a tense, agonizing standoff with deeply frustrated detectives. As the weeks agonizingly progressed, the brutal, unforgiving North Dakota winter descended upon the region, burying the vast, rural landscape beneath feet of impenetrable snow and effectively halting the massive physical search operations. The investigation transitioned into a suffocating, deeply painful waiting period, forcing the victim's family and the entire community to endure months of profound psychological torment, while the prime suspect sat securely in police custody, completely unwilling to yield his horrifying secret. This terrifying phase of the narrative perfectly illustrates the catastrophic systemic failure of releasing an unrehabilitated, highly violent offender back into the public sphere without adequate monitoring, directly resulting in the devastating loss of an innocent life. The excruciating, months-long accumulation of suspense finally reached its heartbreaking, inevitable climax with the slow, methodical transition of the seasons, as the harsh winter snows gradually began to melt across the northern plains in the spring of 2004. On the tragic afternoon of April 17, a highly specialized, dedicated search and rescue team was conducting a rigorous, heavily coordinated sweep of a rugged, heavily wooded ravine located just outside the rural town of Crookston, Minnesota. Deep within this isolated, treacherous terrain, deliberately chosen for its severe inaccessibility and profound lack of public visibility, the searchers finally made the devastating discovery that permanently extinguished the lingering, desperate hopes of the entire nation. The team located the partially concealed, heavily decomposed remains of Drive-thru, providing irrefutable, deeply horrifying physical confirmation that the violent abduction captured implicitly by the dropped phone call had rapidly culminated in a brutal execution. The subsequent, highly detailed forensic examination conducted by the medical examiner revealed a harrowing narrative of extreme violence, definitively confirming that the young student had been subjected to severe physical trauma, sexually assaulted, and brutally stabbed before being discarded in the freezing elements. This monumental, profoundly heartbreaking discovery instantly transformed the highly publicized, agonizing missing persons investigation into a definitive capital murder case, violently ripping away any remaining ambiguity surrounding the lethal intentions of Alfonso Rodriguez Jr. The unearthing of her remains in such a desolate, undignified setting stood in stark, horrifying contrast to the vibrant, highly social life she had been living merely months prior, underscoring the absolute, devastating finality of the violence inflicted upon her. This pivotal moment represented the catastrophic intersection of immense investigative competence in tracking the digital and forensic footprint, and the devastating reality that the perpetrator had successfully utilized the desolate regional geography to temporarily obscure his ultimate, monstrous act. The undeniable finality of finding her body in the ravine fundamentally forced the community to permanently confront the absolute horror that a determined, systemically known predator had successfully utilized a routine retail environment to orchestrate and execute a catastrophic atrocity. The stark reality of the crime scene provided the necessary, concrete evidence required by federal prosecutors to ensure that the man responsible would face the absolute maximum judicial penalty for his calculated savagery. Because the abduction and subsequent murder inherently involved the deliberate transportation of a victim across the state boundary separating North Dakota and Minnesota, the United States Department of Justice immediately assumed overarching jurisdiction, charging Rodriguez with the federal crime of kidnapping resulting in death. Throughout the extensive, highly emotional judicial proceedings that followed in 2006, federal prosecutors presented an overwhelmingly airtight, deeply disturbing case built upon the irrefutable forensic evidence recovered from his vehicle and the tragic geographical location of the victim's remains. Confronted by the sheer, undeniable volume of scientific data and the profound, deeply articulated grief of the Stjadin family, a federal jury formally convicted Rodriguez on all counts, ultimately recommending the highly rare application of the federal death penalty. Although this severe sentence was subjected to decades of complex, protracted legal appeals and was ultimately commuted to life in prison without the possibility of parole by the Attorney General in 2021, the judicial outcome ensured his permanent, definitive removal from society. Beyond the sterile confines of the courtroom, the most profound, enduring legacy of this heartbreaking case materialized through massive, deeply necessary federal legislation championed by Drew's grieving family, who tirelessly advocated for systemic reform. In a monumental effort to prevent future atrocities, the United States government formally established the Stjadin National Sex Offender Public Website, a revolutionary, highly integrated database that fundamentally empowered citizens with immediate, transparent access to registry information nationwide. While this crucial legislative victory provided a powerful, enduring testament to Drew's memory, it offered only a cold, administrative closure to a family forever shattered by the senseless, preventable execution of a beloved daughter. The chilling legacy of her abduction permanently reinforces the terrifying concept that public, commercial spaces can swiftly transform into fatal traps when heavily documented predators are permitted to roam freely without rigorous, continuous oversight. This sobering realization effortlessly bridges our investigative journey from the freezing plains of the Midwest to the sprawling, highly populated campus of the University of Illinois, where another brilliant young woman's routine walk would violently intersect with a deceptive, deeply dangerous vehicle. We must now turn our full, unwavering attention to the deeply disturbing case of Yinjing Zhan, an international scholar whose disappearance exposed the terrifying vulnerabilities hidden within the seemingly safe confines of a prestigious academic institution. The sprawling, prestigious campus of the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign represents a global nexus of academic pursuit, typically projecting an unwavering atmosphere of intellectual sanctuary and robust public safety. In the early summer of 2017, this vibrant educational environment served as the temporary home for Yinying Zhang, a 26-year-old visiting scholar from China who possessed an extraordinary intellect and a profound dedication to her agricultural research. Having arrived in the United States mere months prior in April, Yinjing was heavily immersed in studying photosynthesis and crop yields, driven by a deeply ingrained ambition to eventually return to her home country and secure a respected position as a university professor. On the bright, sunny afternoon of June 9, her primary objective temporarily shifted from rigorous academic laboratory work to a completely mundane administrative task, as she was scheduled to travel across the expansive campus to officially sign a lease for a new, more affordable off-campus apartment. Due to a slight delay in the local transit schedule and a momentary geographic miscalculation, Yinying was running marginally late for her appointment, introducing a mild, entirely standard level of anxiety into an otherwise thoroughly ordinary Friday afternoon. As she hurried along the pedestrian pathways, attempting to flag down a passing mass transit bus on West Springfield Avenue, she was actively utilizing her cell phone to text the property manager, profusely apologizing for her tardiness and promising to arrive shortly. In the context of a massive, heavily populated university environment, boasting tens of thousands of students and faculty members, navigating the bustling campus grid in broad daylight is universally considered an activity completely insulated from the threat of catastrophic, predatory violence. There was absolutely no logical reason for this brilliant, highly motivated young woman to suspect that her minor logistical delay would intersect with a meticulously orchestrated trap designed by an individual actively hunting within the academic community. The profound tragedy of this initial phase lies heavily in the stark realization that international scholars frequently place immense, unconditional trust in the perceived safety of American institutional environments, a trust that was about to be violently and systematically exploited. This comforting illusion of academic security, bolstered by the presence of emergency call boxes and heavily trafficked academic buildings, was completely insufficient to protect her from a highly deceptive predator who utilized the guise of helpfulness to orchestrate an unimaginable horror. The precise, irrevocable moment that permanently shattered this academic sanctuary was not an overt, chaotic assault on the sidewalk, but rather a chillingly calm, deceptive interaction silently captured by the university's extensive network of closed-circuit television cameras. At approximately 2:00 p.m., external surveillance footage recorded Yinying standing near a designated bus stop on North Goodwin Avenue, a heavily utilized campus thoroughfare, actively searching for her delayed transit connection when a black Saturn Astra abruptly pulled to the curb directly beside her. The grainy digital video documented a brief, seemingly polite exchange between the solitary scholar and the driver of the vehicle, an individual who was later definitively identified as 27-year-old Brent Christensen, a former physics doctoral student and teaching assistant at the very same university. Christensen, fully aware of the public setting and the presence of passing vehicular traffic, clearly utilized his status as a fellow academic peer to project a deceptive aura of safety, likely offering the visibly stressed, late, running student a quick ride to her impending apartment appointment. Lacking any overt reason to distrust a well-dressed, articulate individual operating a clean vehicle on a university street, Yinying made the entirely understandable, yet tragically fatal, decision to accept the offer of assistance, walking around the front of the car and entering the passenger seat. The security camera, acting as a passive, unblinking witness, captured the black Saturn Astra smoothly merging back into the afternoon traffic, silently carrying the brilliant young scholar away from the public sphere and into an unprecedented, terrifying void. This silent, strictly digital capture represents the absolute point of no return, preserving the exact second when an innocent, highly vulnerable international student was completely stripped of her personal agency through a weaponized display of false altruism. Because the entire abduction was executed without a single raised voice or physical struggle, nearby students and pedestrians remained completely oblivious to the catastrophic felony that had just successfully concluded merely yards away from their position. This highly deceptive, daylight vehicular strike instantly transformed a routine leasing appointment into a massive, heavily scrutinized federal kidnapping investigation, providing authorities with a horrifying visual confirmation that a highly calculated predator was actively utilizing the university infrastructure as a hunting ground. The chilling realization that a predator could so effortlessly lure a highly intelligent victim into a trap utilizing nothing more than a polite demeanor and an open car door fundamentally forced the community to permanently reevaluate the inherent dangers lurking within seemingly secure, everyday interactions. When Ying failed to arrive at the leasing office and her friends were completely unable to establish any digital contact as the evening progressed, a frantic, rapidly escalating missing persons report was filed with the University of Illinois Police Department, immediately triggering a massive interagency response. Recognizing the severe, international implications of the disappearance, the Federal Bureau of Investigation rapidly absorbed the case, deploying highly specialized technical analysts to meticulously scrutinize the campus surveillance footage in an attempt to identify the specific vehicle involved in the abduction. Through advanced, high-resolution enhancement of the digital video, federal agents successfully isolated specific, highly unique characteristics of the black Saturn Astra, specifically noting a distinctively cracked front right hubcap and a heavily tinted sunroof that fundamentally separated it from identical models. Utilizing the state's massive vehicular registration database, investigators cross-referenced these incredibly specific visual markers and systematically narrowed their focus down to a single vehicle registered to Brent Christensen, immediately placing him at the absolute center of the intensifying, high-stakes investigation. When initially interrogated by federal agents, Christensen aggressively deployed a series of calculated fabrications, claiming he was completely uninvolved and had spent the entire afternoon playing video games inside his apartment. A narrative that rapidly disintegrated under the crushing weight of the surveillance evidence. Confronted with the undeniable video placing his vehicle at the exact scene of the abduction, Christensen chillingly altered his story, smoothly admitting he had offered a distressed Asian woman a ride, but falsely claiming he had dropped her off safely just blocks away after a minor navigational disagreement. Recognizing that they were dealing with a highly intelligent, intensely deceptive individual who had meticulously sanitized his vehicle and apartment prior to their arrival, the FBI deployed a highly covert, desperately risky investigative tactic, successfully convincing Christensen's own girlfriend, Tara Bullis, to act as a confidential informant. Bullis, operating under immense psychological pressure and fully cooperating with the massive federal task force, agreed to wear a concealed, highly sensitive recording device during her daily interactions with the prime suspect, initiating a deeply tense, agonizing period of covert audio surveillance. As the days dragged on without any sign of Ying, the entire campus community rallied, organizing massive, highly emotional vigils and distributing thousands of flyers, completely unaware that the man responsible for the agonizing tragedy was actively walking among them, heavily monitored by federal agents. This agonizing phase of the investigation highlighted a massive, incredibly complex psychological game of chess, pitting the massive technological resources of the federal government against the deeply arrogant, highly calculated evasions of a predator who firmly believed he had committed the perfect, unsolvable crime. The unbearable, deeply suffocating tension surrounding the investigation finally ruptured during a massive, highly publicized campus solidarity walk held in Yinjing's honor on June 29, an event that Brent Christensen brazenly attended alongside his secretly wired girlfriend. As the couple stood amidst the profound, collective grief of the university community, surrounded by desperate students and deeply mourning faculty members holding photographs of the missing scholar, Christensen began to speak with a terrifying, deeply callous arrogance directly into the concealed federal microphone. In a series of horrifying, unequivocally damning audio recordings, Christensen enthusiastically bragged about his status as a successful serial killer, chillingly pointing out other individuals in the crowd who matched his preferred victim profile and actively reveling in the massive police response he had successfully generated. The devastating, undeniable climax materialized when he began to explicitly detail the horrific fate of Yinying Zhang, completely dismantling any lingering, desperate hopes that the brilliant young scholar might somehow still be found alive in captivity. He clinically, mercilessly described how he had forcefully brought her back to his heavily fortified apartment, violently detailing the extensive, brutal assault she suffered and expressing a twisted, deeply disturbing admiration for how fiercely and courageously she had physically fought back against his overwhelming violence. Most devastatingly, Christensen aggressively boasted that she was permanently gone, and that her remains had been disposed of so meticulously that they would never be discovered by law enforcement, effectively cementing his complete, monstrous control over the entire tragic narrative. These profoundly chilling, irrefutable audio captures provided the exact, concrete evidentiary threshold the federal task force desperately required, prompting heavily armed FBI agents to aggressively swarm Christensen the very next day, formally taking him into federal custody and neutralizing his immediate threat to the community. This dramatic, strictly audio-driven climax fundamentally shifted the entire paradigm of the case, transforming a deeply mysterious, frustrating missing persons investigation into a definitive, overwhelmingly documented capital murder prosecution built almost entirely upon the suspect's own horrific hubris. The agonizing realization that the predator had brazenly stood amongst the grieving community, actively mocking their desperate search efforts, while confessing his monstrous actions, added a profoundly dark, deeply disturbing layer of psychological terror to the already devastating tragedy. Because the devastating crime involved the deliberate, heavily premeditated kidnapping of an internationally recognized scholar, the United States Department of Justice aggressively pursued a federal capital murder conviction against Brent Christensen, constructing a massive, overwhelmingly airtight case centered predominantly around his own recorded confessions. During the highly publicized, emotionally grueling trial in 2019, federal prosecutors forced the jury to confront the absolute, monstrous reality of his actions, utilizing the deeply disturbing wiretap recordings to prove the immense, calculated brutality inflicted upon the defenseless student within the confines of his apartment. Despite the overwhelming, incontrovertible evidence resulting in a swift, highly definitive guilty verdict, the deeply divided jury was ultimately unable to reach the mandatory unanimous consensus required to impose the federal death penalty, a deeply agonizing, highly frustrating outcome for the grieving Zhang family. Consequently, the presiding federal judge formally sentenced Christensen to a mandatory term of life in prison without any possibility of parole, permanently securing his absolute removal from society, while delivering a blistering, heavily critical condemnation of his complete lack of human remorse. Although this strict judicial finality provided a necessary, administrative conclusion to the prosecutorial phase, it offered only a hollow, deeply fractured sense of justice for Yinying's deeply devastated parents, who were forced to return to China without the physical remains of their beloved daughter. Based on subsequent, heavily delayed disclosures from Christensen's defense team following the trial, investigators believe he cruelly dismembered the young woman and dispersed her remains into the municipal garbage system, rendering a physical recovery from a massive, highly compacted regional landfill practically impossible. The enduring, profoundly heartbreaking legacy of Yinying Zhang's abduction fundamentally shatters the protective illusion of academic sanctuaries, permanently demonstrating how a highly deceptive predator can seamlessly utilize the standard, polite interactions of a campus environment to execute a catastrophic, utterly devastating strike. The terrifying reality of a completely ordinary errand transforming into a deeply agonizing, technologically complex mystery forces us to examine how critical digital infrastructure frequently dictates the desperate pace of modern investigations. This chilling intersection of technology, routine errands, and sudden abduction seamlessly bridges our narrative from the sprawling academic campus in Illinois to a heavily trafficked retail store in Kansas, where another young woman's quick trip to buy a gift rapidly spiraled into a devastating, frantic race against delayed cellular data. We must now turn our full, unflinching attention to the highly tragic, heavily scrutinized case of 18-year-old Kelsey Smith, an abduction that forever altered how telecommunications companies handle the terrifying, ticking clock of a missing persons emergency. The sprawling, heavily commercialized suburb of Overland Park, Kansas, projects an unmistakable aura of Midwestern security, heavily defined by its busy retail corridors and tightly knit community infrastructure. On the bright, completely ordinary Saturday afternoon of June 2, 2007, this seemingly impenetrable suburban safety served as the backdrop for 18-year-old Kelsey Smith as she navigated a highly routine errand. Having just proudly graduated from high school days prior, Kelsey possessed her entire future ahead of her, characterized by a vibrant social life and a profound, underlying sense of responsibility instilled by her father, who served as a local police officer. Her primary objective for the afternoon was to visit a massive, highly populated Target department store to purchase a simple, heartfelt gift for her boyfriend to commemorate their 6-month anniversary. The sheer scale and continuous, bustling activity of a big box retail environment on a weekend afternoon universally projects a fundamental illusion of absolute, unwavering safety for its patrons. As she parked her vehicle and walked through the sliding glass doors into the brightly lit, heavily air-conditioned retail space, she joined hundreds of other shoppers engaging in the exact same mundane consumer behaviors. There was absolutely no logical reason for a young woman, fully aware of her surroundings and operating within a massive, heavily monitored commercial building, to suspect that she was actively walking into a lethal scenario. The profound tragedy of this initial phase rests heavily upon the stark realization that predators do not exclusively hunt in desolate, shadowy environments, but actively infiltrate the most heavily populated, thoroughly normalized centers of daily commerce. This comforting illusion of retail security, bolstered by the presence of families and the continuous hum of consumer activity, was completely insufficient to protect her from an individual who actively sought to exploit the momentary vulnerabilities of an independent shopper. Her brief, completely ordinary trip to buy a simple anniversary gift unknowingly placed her directly into the crosshairs of a highly dangerous predator, permanently altering the foundational sense of security for the entire region. The precise, terrifying methodology of her abduction was not left to the uncertain realm of eyewitness testimony, but was instead meticulously recorded by the department store's expansive, highly sophisticated internal closed-circuit television network. As Kelsey calmly navigated the brightly lit aisles, carefully selecting the anniversary gift, the silent, unblinking security cameras captured a deeply chilling, parallel narrative unfolding merely steps behind her. A white male in his early 20s, later definitively identified as Edwin Hall, was recorded entering the massive retail space exactly 30 seconds after Kelsey walked through the front doors. Displaying a terrifying, highly practiced level of predatory surveillance, Hall systematically followed the young woman throughout the massive store, deliberately maintaining a discreet, calculated distance to avoid triggering any defensive alarm. The digital footage definitively proved that he was not engaging in normal consumer behavior, but was actively, relentlessly stalking her movements, waiting for the precise moment her vulnerability would peak upon exiting the perceived sanctuary of the building. As Kelsey paid for her items and initiated the short walk back to her parked vehicle, the exterior parking lot cameras captured the final, devastating sequence of her disappearance in broad daylight. The grainy, distant surveillance video showed Kelsey arriving at her car and preparing to load her purchases, completely unaware that Hall had rapidly advanced his position to intercept her departure. The camera recorded a sudden, frantic flash of movement near the driver's side door, visually confirming a violent, incredibly brief physical struggle as Hall overwhelmed the 18-year-old girl and forcefully shoved her into her own vehicle. This silent, Strictly digital capture represents the absolute point of no return, permanently preserving the horrifying reality of a predator successfully executing a targeted abduction amidst rows of parked cars under the afternoon sun. Because the assault was executed with rapid, overwhelming force utilizing the concealment of her own vehicle's open door, passing shoppers pushing their carts remained completely oblivious to the catastrophic felony actively concluding merely yards away. When Kelsey completely failed to return home, and her cell phone went agonizingly unanswered, her deeply concerned family immediately recognized the severe anomaly, prompting a rapid mobilization of local law enforcement agencies. Approximately 4 hours after the terrifying incident captured on the target cameras, authorities located her abandoned vehicle sitting ominously in the parking lot of a Macy's department store directly across the street at the Oak Park Mall. A meticulous inspection of the recovered car revealed her purchased items, her purse, and her wallet securely left inside, definitively ruling out robbery and immediately elevating the situation to a highly critical life-threatening kidnapping investigation. Desperate to locate the missing teenager, investigators and the Smith family immediately focused their full attention on Kelsey's cell phone, knowing with absolute certainty that the device was physically with her and actively communicating with local telecommunications towers. They urgently pleaded with her cellular service provider to release the critical geographic ping data, hoping the digital breadcrumbs would instantly provide a precise, localized search radius to deploy their massive volunteer force, which had mobilized under the banner of Kelsey's Army. However, this desperate, highly urgent request was met with a devastating, deeply bureaucratic refusal, as the telecommunications company strictly cited corporate privacy policies and demanded a formal, judicial subpoena before they would release the potentially life-saving geographic coordinates. This agonizing, completely preventable delay severely hindered the momentum of the investigation, forcing detectives to rely heavily on the meticulous, frame-by-frame analysis of the target surveillance footage to identify the unknown stalker in the white shirt. Fingerprint analysts simultaneously processed Kelsey's recovered vehicle, successfully isolating an unidentified set of prints on the driver's side seatbelt that did not match anyone within the victim's immediate family or social circle. As days agonizingly passed without any sign of the young woman, the intense, suffocating frustration regarding the withheld cellular data compounded the profound psychological torment endured by her family. The investigation transformed into a deeply painful, ticking clock scenario, heavily defined by massive community search efforts that were essentially operating blind while the vital digital map to her location remained locked behind a wall of corporate privacy protocols. The unbearable, suffocating tension surrounding the active search finally ruptured on June 6, 4 agonizing days after the abduction, when the telecommunications provider eventually relented to the mounting legal pressure and released the critical geographic ping data. This vital influx of digital intelligence immediately provided the Federal Bureau of Investigation with a specific, highly actionable geographic coordinate, mapping the final known location of the cellular device to a rugged, heavily wooded area near a lake in Grandview, Missouri, approximately 20 miles away from the retail center. Massive, highly specialized search and rescue teams were immediately redirected from the Kansas suburbs to the remote Missouri wilderness, initiating a rigorous, heavily coordinated physical sweep of the designated, deeply overgrown terrain. Deep within this isolated environment, the desperate, lingering hopes of the Smith family and the entire Overland Park community were permanently, violently extinguished when searchers located the heavily concealed remains of Kelsey Smith. The subsequent, highly detailed forensic examination conducted by the medical examiner revealed a harrowing, monstrous narrative of her final hours, definitively confirming that the young woman had been subjected to severe sexual assault before being brutally strangled to death utilizing her own belt. Simultaneously, the forensic analysis of the unidentified fingerprints recovered from the seatbelt of her vehicle yielded a definitive, incontrovertible match to Edwin Hall, permanently linking the stalker, captured on the target surveillance cameras, to the brutal execution in the woods. Armed with this overwhelming combination of physical, digital, and visual evidence, heavily armed law enforcement officers aggressively descended upon Hall, swiftly taking him into custody and formally ending his immediate threat to the public. Hall, a married father who appeared to lead a completely ordinary life, offered no substantial explanation for his monstrous actions, severely chilling investigators with his complete, sociopathic detachment from the profound devastation he had single-handedly caused. This dramatic, deeply tragic climax fundamentally shifted the entire paradigm of the case, transforming a desperate missing persons search into a definitive capital murder prosecution built upon an overwhelming mountain of irrefutable forensic and surveillance data. The discovery of her body in the desolate Missouri woods stood in stark, horrifying contrast to the vibrant, brightly lit retail aisle, where she was last seen safely, underscoring the absolute, devastating finality of the violence inflicted upon her. Facing a rapidly constructed, overwhelmingly airtight prosecutorial case that possessed the highly probable potential to secure a definitive death penalty conviction under Kansas law, Edwin Hall aggressively sought to negotiate a judicial plea agreement. In July 2008, Hall formally pleaded guilty to a massive litany of charges, including capital murder, aggravated kidnapping, rape, and aggravated sodomy, explicitly choosing to accept the absolute maximum non-capital penalty in exchange for his life. The presiding judge subsequently sentenced Hall to a mandatory, irrevocable term of life in prison, without any possibility of parole, permanently securing his absolute removal from society, and ensuring he would spend the entirety of his natural existence secured within the Lansing Correctional Facility. While this strict judicial finality provided a necessary, administrative conclusion to the prosecutorial phase, it offered only a hollow, deeply fractured sense of justice for Kelsey's profoundly devastated parents, who were forced to navigate a reality permanently devoid of their beloved daughter. Channeling their profound, unimaginable grief into highly aggressive, deeply necessary legislative advocacy, Greg and Missy Smith established the Kelsey Smith Foundation, fiercely dedicating their lives to ensuring no other family would suffer the agonizing, bureaucratic delays that plagued their daughter's investigation. Their relentless, highly organized lobbying efforts culminated in the monumental passage of the Kelsey Smith Act, a revolutionary piece of legislation that legally compels telecommunications companies to immediately provide critical location data to law enforcement in verified emergency situations. This crucial legislative victory provided a powerful, enduring testament to Kelsey's memory, fundamentally transforming the national investigative protocols regarding cellular data and successfully saving countless lives in the years following her tragic death. The enduring, profoundly heartbreaking legacy of her abduction fundamentally shatters the protective illusion of massive commercial retail centers, permanently demonstrating how a highly predatory individual can seamlessly exploit the routine behaviors of a completely unsuspecting shopper. This chilling intersection of public surveillance, predatory stalking, and the weaponization of a victim's own vehicle seamlessly bridges our narrative from the suburban expanses of the American Midwest to the bustling, densely populated urban corridors of Melbourne, Australia. We must now turn our full, unwavering attention to the profoundly disturbing, highly publicized case of Jill Mager, whose solitary walk home from a neighborhood pub was violently intercepted under the watchful eye of a city's security network. The vibrant, heavily populated urban corridor of Sydney Road in the Brunswick suburb of Melbourne, Australia, is widely recognized as a bustling cultural epicenter, brimming with late-night venues and continuous pedestrian activity. On the cool evening of September 21, 2012, this dynamic urban environment provided the seemingly secure backdrop for a completely standard Friday night out for 29-year-old Jill Mager, an energetic and deeply beloved Irish expatriate. Jill was employed as a scheduling coordinator for the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, possessing a bright, extensively social personality and a deeply committed marriage to her husband, Tom, who was waiting for her just a short distance away at their shared apartment. After spending several hours socializing and drinking with her close colleagues at Bar Etiquette, a popular local establishment situated directly on the main thoroughfare. Jill made the deeply understandable decision to embark on the brief, roughly 5-minute walk back to her residence at approximately 1:30 a.m. In the context of a modern, heavily surveilled metropolitan environment, a confident adult walking a highly familiar, brightly illuminated route along a major arterial road is universally perceived as a completely standard, incredibly low-risk activity. The streets were not completely deserted. Passing cars, lingering patrons from nearby bars, and the ubiquitous presence of commercial security cameras combined to project a massive, reassuring illusion of absolute communal safety and deterrence. There was absolutely no logical reason for anyone to suspect that this brief, highly exposed urban transit would be violently intersected by a meticulously predatory individual actively hunting within the shadows of the storefronts. The profound tragedy of this initial phase lies entirely in the stark, devastating contrast between a young woman's joyful, utterly normal celebration of the weekend and the terrifying, heavily documented darkness actively waiting for her just a few meters down the pavement. Her decision to walk home alone, a choice made by countless individuals every single night in cities around the globe, unknowingly placed her directly into the path of an exceptionally violent offender who heavily utilized the chaotic energy of the late night street to mask his lethal intentions. This comforting illusion of urban security was about to be methodically and brutally dismantled, proving that even the most densely populated, heavily recorded environments cannot automatically physically intervene to stop a rapidly unfolding nightmare. The precise, heavily scrutinized moment that irrevocably derailed Jill's life was not a chaotic, screaming struggle in a dark alley, but rather a chillingly aggressive interception silently captured by the high-definition security camera of the Duchess Boutique. At exactly 1:41 a.m., the unblinking digital eye positioned above the bridal shop's entrance recorded Jill walking steadily down the sidewalk, projecting the absolute normalcy of a woman simply trying to navigate the final stretch of her journey home. However, the surveillance footage simultaneously captured a heavily built male figure wearing a distinctively bright blue hoodie, later definitively identified as Adrian Ernest Bailey, actively loitering in a shadowed alcove directly within her path. The chilling video documented Bailey suddenly stepping out of the shadows and physically obstructing Jill's forward momentum, forcing a brief, heavily tense interaction on the brightly lit public pavement. Although the surveillance system lacked audio capabilities, the devastating visual data clearly displayed Jill's profound discomfort and defensive body language as she actively attempted to step around the intimidating figure and continue her route. Despite her clear, visual attempts to politely disengage and retreat from the aggressive confrontation, Bailey persistently matched her movements, utilizing his overwhelming physical presence to herd her toward a narrow, obscured laneway located just off the main arterial road. Within mere seconds, the silent, terrifying digital capture showed both individuals stepping completely out of the camera's fixed frame, marking the absolute point of no return, where a deeply uncomfortable street encounter violently escalated into a catastrophic physical abduction. Because the initial interception was executed utilizing intimidation and physical blocking rather than overt, highly visible striking, passing vehicular traffic and distant pedestrians remained completely unaware that a lethal, non-consensual extraction was actively occurring mere feet away. This stark, undeniably horrifying video evidence fundamentally altered the entire trajectory of the impending investigation, providing a deeply chilling, time-stamped visual record of a nighttime urban abduction that would permanently traumatize the entire nation of Australia. The haunting footage from the boutique seamlessly transformed an ordinary street corner into an infamous, highly documented crime scene, permanently preserving the exact second an innocent woman was forcefully swallowed by the city's unseen predatory underbelly. When the morning sun illuminated the city and Tom Mater awoke to the horrifying realization that his wife had never returned to their apartment, a frantic, rapidly escalating missing persons investigation was immediately launched by the Victoria Police. Recognizing the immense immediate danger, her family and friends bypassed traditional bureaucratic delays and instantly ignited an unprecedented, massive social media campaign, circulating her photograph and last known location to millions of highly engaged users across various digital platforms. This sprawling, digitally native public awareness initiative heavily pressured law enforcement to execute a meticulous, incredibly rapid retrieval of all available closed-circuit television footage from the commercial businesses lining Sydney Road. The critical, highly anticipated investigative breakthrough materialized when detectives successfully isolated the Duchess boutique footage, instantly releasing the deeply chilling images of the man in the blue hoodie to the deeply sensitized, heavily mobilized public. The visual release triggered an overwhelming avalanche of community tips, allowing specialized police analysts to aggressively trace the suspect's movements through a complex, interconnected web of municipal cameras and toll road monitors. This massive digital dragnet ultimately yielded a highly specific, definitive identification, exposing the man in the video as Adrian Ernest Bailey, an incredibly dangerous, heavily convicted serial rapist who was shockingly operating within the community while on parole. Armed with this terrifying, incredibly urgent intelligence, investigators aggressively acquired warrants to track Bailey's cellular phone activity, mapping a highly disturbing digital trajectory that showed his device traveling far outside the metropolitan boundaries of Melbourne in the hours following the abduction. The police immediately subjected Bailey to intense, heavily fortified surveillance, monitoring his every movement, while specialized forensic teams frantically searched his registered vehicle and residence for any microscopic trace of the missing woman. As the intense, suffocating days dragged on without any physical sign of Jill, the entire city of Melbourne operated in a state of profound, highly vocal anxiety, completely horrified by the terrifying revelation that a known, hyper-violent predator had been freely permitted to hunt on their streets. This agonizing phase of the investigation highlighted a massive, incredibly complex mobilization of both civilian digital networking and advanced police technology, all desperately racing against the grim, highly probable reality that the victim had already been subjected to catastrophic harm. The unbearable, deeply suffocating tension surrounding the active search finally ruptured into a definitive, highly aggressive law enforcement action on September 27, when specialized police units aggressively descended upon Bailey and formally took him into custody. Within the heavily secured, highly monitored confines of the police interrogation room, Bailey initially attempted to deploy a series of calculated, completely fabricated denials, desperately attempting to distance himself from the overwhelming visual evidence captured by the boutique's camera. However, the deeply experienced detectives systematically dismantled his pathetic facade, confronting him with the undeniable, irrefutable combination of the high-definition surveillance footage, his highly suspicious cellular ping data, and the mounting forensic anomalies discovered within his personal vehicle. Crushed beneath the absolute, unyielding weight of the investigative evidence and his own profound, sociopathic hubris, Bailey ultimately abandoned his steadfast denials and provided a terrifying, deeply horrifying confession detailing the exact, brutal methodology of his crime. He clinically, mercilessly admitted that he had forcefully dragged Jill into the obscured laneway, violently sexually assaulted her, and brutally strangled her to death to prevent her from reporting the catastrophic violation to the authorities. Most devastatingly, Bailey agreed to explicitly guide the massive, heavily armed police convoy to the precise, highly secluded geographical coordinates, where he had meticulously attempted to erase his monstrous actions from existence. Operating under the heavy cover of darkness, the massive investigative task force traveled approximately 50 kilometers northwest of Melbourne to the desolate, highly rugged rural area of Gisborne South, completely guided by the meticulous directions of the confessed killer. Deep within this isolated, treacherous terrain, deliberately chosen for its severe inaccessibility and profound lack of public visibility, the searchers finally made the devastating discovery that permanently extinguished the lingering, desperate hopes of the entire country. The specialized forensic teams painstakingly unearthed the violently concealed, shallow grave containing the remains of Jill Mader, providing irrefutable, Deeply horrifying physical confirmation that the chilling street interception had rapidly culminated in a brutal execution. This monumental, profoundly heartbreaking discovery instantly transformed the highly publicized missing persons investigation into a definitive, overwhelmingly documented murder case, violently ripping away any remaining ambiguity and permanently cementing the Duchess boutique footage as a historical record of absolute tragedy. In the immediate, highly emotional aftermath of the horrific discovery, the Australian judicial system aggressively pursued the absolute maximum penalties available, constructing an overwhelmingly airtight prosecutorial case built entirely upon the suspect's own recorded confession and the irrefutable forensic evidence. Confronted with an inescapable mountain of scientifically verified data, Adrian Ernest Bailey formally pleaded guilty to the horrific charges of rape and murder, completely avoiding a protracted, agonizing trial that would have further traumatized the grieving Metter family. The presiding Supreme Court judge ultimately sentenced the monstrous predator to a mandatory term of life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 35 years, permanently securing his absolute removal from society and ensuring he would spend the vast majority of his natural existence secured within a maximum security facility. Beyond the sterile confines of the courtroom, the devastating, entirely preventable nature of Jill's murder triggered an unprecedented, highly visceral public reckoning regarding the catastrophic, deeply systemic failures of the Victorian parole system. Over 30,000 deeply grieving, highly outraged citizens flooded the bustling corridor of Sydney Road in a massive, highly peaceful march, demanding immediate, sweeping legislative reforms to ensure that repeat, hyper-violent sexual offenders were no longer granted the lethal opportunity to roam freely among the public. This monumental, deeply powerful community uprising directly forced the government to completely overhaul the deeply flawed parole board, implementing strict, heavily enforced regulatory changes that fundamentally prioritized public safety over the administrative release of deeply dangerous criminals. While this crucial legislative victory provided a powerful, enduring testament to Jill's vibrant memory, it offered only a hollow, incredibly painful sense of justice for her deeply devastated husband and family, who were forced to navigate a reality permanently devoid of her bright, loving presence. The enduring, profoundly heartbreaking legacy of her abduction fundamentally shatters the protective illusion of crowded urban environments, permanently demonstrating how a heavily documented predator can seamlessly exploit the chaotic energy of a city street to execute a catastrophic, utterly devastating strike. The terrifying reality of a completely ordinary walk home transforming into a highly publicized, digitally chronicled nightmare forces us to permanently confront the profound, deeply unsettling vulnerabilities inherent in our modern, highly surveilled society. As we reflect upon these 10 horrifying narratives of brazen abduction, we must seamlessly transition to a final, deeply sobering examination of what these passive, unblinking cameras truly represent in the broader context of our collective safety. These 10 chilling cases ultimately force us to confront a deeply unsettling reality. If unblinking surveillance networks in broad daylight cannot physically deter a determined predator, how much of our daily security is merely a comforting illusion built upon fragile systemic oversight rather than true, actionable protection? Thank you for watching this difficult but necessary examination of the facts. Stay safe and always remain vigilant in your surroundings.